23 August 1942, the Soviet Union, after surviving one of the worst winters in Russian history, coupled with a fierce Red Army counteroffensive, the Wehrmacht is once again on the move as the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, pushes past the Don River, splitting Soviet defensive lines in the area, driving toward the city of Ranok, just north of Stalingrad on the Volga River. As winter drew to a close and both sides prepared to return to battle, Stalin was certain that Hitler would order a renewed attack on Moscow. Prior to being halted by the weather, the Germans had driven to the doorstep of the Soviet capital before being pushed back by the surprisingly potent counteroffensive. Believing that they would pick up where they left off, the Russians concentrated their forces near Moscow. In addition, Stalin, determined to continue driving the enemy back, resolved to attack south toward the Crimea and liberate Sevastopol, which had been under siege for months. In both cases, Stalin's reasoning proved to be flawed. Having underestimated the strength of the Germans in the region, the Soviet offensive was a complete failure, and Sevastopol fell to the Nazis on 4 July. A second offensive in the southwest yielded an even worse result, when the Red Army stumbled into a German trap and 100,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. As for Moscow, Hitler was content to leave things as they were while he focused instead on an offensive in the south. On 28 June, Army Group A began driving out of the Ukraine and toward the Caucasus, while just to the north, Army Group B, spearheaded by the panzers of von Paulus's Sixth Army, started advancing rapidly toward Stalingrad. With the ground baked hard by the summer sun, July and August found the armored divisions of the 6th driving hard and fast toward the Don. Now, having broken through, they arrive at Ranok, a mere 35 miles from their objective. As Stalingrad's defenders struggle to prepare for the impending ground assault, the Luftwaffe fills the sky over the city. Hundreds of Ju-88 bombers and Stukas fly some 4,000 sorties on the 23rd and 24th, turning Stalingrad into a sea of flames stretching 25 miles along the banks of the Volga. Despite the devastation raining down from above, the citizens of Stalingrad continued to prepare for its defense. Trenches are dug, fortifications built. Factory workers churn out tanks and guns 24 hours a day. Thousands of teenagers, officially too young to serve in the military, are put in uniform and given weapons. When there are no more rifles to be issued, soldiers are armed with metal pipes. Medical units are disbanded and their members pressed into battle. The wounded will be left where they fall while others carry on. And so it seems that, as it was at Moscow nearly a year ago, the Germans stand on the brink of capturing a Soviet city so crucial it might be considered the linchpin of the nation. Should Stalingrad fall, as Hitler has been proclaiming it will, it can be only a matter of time before Russia joins the list of countries conquered by the Reich. August 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrives in Cairo to assess the situation facing the British Eighth Army in North Africa. Unimpressed by the performance of his commander in the region, General Claude Auchinleck, Churchill has decided to replace him. For months, the Eighth Army has, in Churchill's view, made little use of the tremendous amount of war materiel it has been allotted to drive the Germans out of North Africa. The fall of Tobruk was, for the already disgusted Prime Minister, the straw that broke the camel's back. Churchill, after conferring with General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, appoints General Sir Harold Alexander as head of the Near East Command. Churchill then decides to place Lieutenant General W.H.E. Gott in charge of the Eighth Army. He is, however, forced to change his plans the next day as General Gott's plane is shot down en route to Cairo. His next choice for command is Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. Alexander has reservations about Montgomery, particularly his penchant for taking credit for others' accomplishments. Despite these misgivings, Alexander knows Montgomery is an excellent battlefield commander and highly regarded by the troops. On 11 August, Churchill travels to Moscow to meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. The purpose of the visit is to apologize to Stalin. There will be no Second European Front in 1942. Churchill explains that an Allied assault against Hitler's fortress Europe would be doomed to failure until more men and materiel are available. As a consolation, he assures Stalin there will be a combined British and American offensive against Axis forces in North Africa in the fall. Having completed the delicate task of soothing the Russians, Churchill on 19 August returns to Cairo to meet with his newly appointed commanders. He tells Alexander that his one and only goal is to destroy the German forces in North Africa, and that all his efforts should be focused on doing so. Alexander assures the Prime Minister that he understands and that he will tenaciously pursue that goal. Churchill then travels to Montgomery's headquarters at Berg El Arab. The Prime Minister listens to Monty's plans for an offensive against Rommel in October. He presses the general, saying that October is too late, the offensive must begin sooner. Monty replies that if the offensive is to be launched before October, the PM will have to find someone else to lead it. Churchill yields. Monty then explains to the Prime Minister his plan for the defense of El Alamein, where he believes Rommel will strike next. At the center of his defense will be the 22nd Brigade, which is dug in at the base of Alam Halfa Ridge. He has instructed his commanders to hold here at all costs and not, under any circumstances, to be drawn into the open against Rommel's armor. For Churchill, the trip has been satisfying. Even if the timetable isn't exactly to his liking, his commanders have a specific plan for defeating Rommel and have taken concrete steps toward achieving that goal. But for Churchill, the biggest evidence of change in the situation is not on any map, but on the faces of the men of the 8th Army. There is a cocky assuredness back in their step and a gleam in their eye that heartens the Prime Minister. Now he is certain he has all the right pieces in place to deliver the Germans a crushing blow in North Africa. August 1942, the Mediterranean. An Allied convoy steams toward the island of Malta, located 60 miles south of Sicily. 14 cargo vessels escorted by destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers are determined to deliver crucial aircraft and supplies to the beleaguered garrison on the island. Using it for its airfields and as a base for warships, the British have been devastatingly effective in no daring dash across the desert, no surprise attack at the British flank that will win the day. Rommel knows that he is not going to be able to take El Alamein and withdraws with what remains of his Panzer Corps. As he goes, the RAF continues its harassment, bombing the retreating Nazi column, turning the roadway into a kind of highway of death. It presents a tempting opportunity. A sudden charge by the British might well finish the Africa Corps for good. The British armor, however, stays put. Montgomery's predecessors were victimized several times by German counterattacks, and Montgomery, who is as careful a commander as there is, decides that it is better to leave the potential knockout blow for another day. At El Alamein, he will be satisfied with a simple victory. 31 July 1942, the South Pacific. After gathering just south of the Fiji Islands, an American naval task force under the command of Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher set sail for the Solomon Islands. The operation, dubbed Watchtower, marks the beginning of what promises to be a long and bloody struggle to drive the Japanese from their chain of Pacific Island Japanese defenses, which the Allies are now attempting to exploit. The Solomons, located in the torrid latitudes just south of the equator, offer the Americans two vital bases: a deep-water seaport at the island of Tulagi and, perhaps more important, a partially completed airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. The importance of these facilities is not lost to either side. For the Japanese, they offer a forward base from which their naval and air forces can impede the flow of men and materiel pouring across the South Pacific to Australia. For the Allies, taking the port and airfield will not only help secure the supply routes, but will also provide a platform for launching far-reaching offensive operations against the Japanese. Under cover of heavy weather, Fletcher's task force is able to approach their objective undetected by the Japanese. The men of the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandergrift, prepare for what will be the first true test of American land forces in this war. In the pre-dawn hours of 7 August, naval guns and carrier-based aircraft begin pounding Japanese positions on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Australian coast watchers in the hills on Guadalcanal direct the fire, which is extremely effective. The Australians are amazed at the accuracy of the Navy's big guns, watching as one by one Japanese positions vanish in clouds of fire and flying. As the Marines head for the beaches on both Tulagi and Guadalcanal, there is no response from the Japanese on the islands. The men in the assault boats share a cautious optimism. Reaching the beach, it seems as if the bombardment has driven the Japanese off the island. The Marines land completely unopposed, and as they move inland to the partially completed airfield at Lunga Point, it's quite clear that the Japanese pulled out in a hurry. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the unloading of supplies has been interrupted by a flight of twin-engined Japanese bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries and Navy fighters quickly downed 7 of the attackers and forced the rest to flee, but the attacks continue off and on through the afternoon of the 8th. While they do little damage, they cause serious delays in the unloading of equipment and supplies. By late afternoon on the 8th, Admiral Fletcher believes he can no longer keep his ships anchored off Guadalcanal. He is certain that the Japanese fleet must be steaming toward him. Fuel reserves for his fighters are dangerously low, threatening to leave the critical flat tops defenseless. He orders the carriers to steam out of the area, leaving the amphibious force without air cover. Without the protection of the Fleet Air Wing, Admiral Richmond Turner informs Vandergrift that he will have to withdraw his cruisers and transports to prevent losing them to the Japanese bombers. Vandergrift is furious. If the amphibious support ships leave, his Marines will be stranded on these jungle islands with only a portion of their supplies. Near midnight, as the two commanders feud, a Japanese naval force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer slips past American pickets near Savo Island, 10 miles off the coast of Guadalcanal. Catching Turner's force completely off guard, the Japanese hit the Allies with torpedoes and gunfire. In a matter of moments, an Australian and 3 American cruisers are turned into burning masses of twisted steel and begin sinking to the bottom. The Japanese commander, elated with his success but fearful that Fletcher's carriers would be launching a retaliatory airstrike, decides to retire to Rabaul. By doing that, The Japanese missed their chance to sink the transport and supply ships sitting defenseless off the coast of Guadalcanal. After this humiliating defeat, Turner orders what is left of his force to leave the area. He takes with him tons of supplies, rations, barbed wire, field artillery pieces, and the equipment the Marines need to complete the airfield. 1,000 Marine reserves are also on the ships as they turn and sail off. The 6,000 Marines on Tulagi and the 10,000 on Guadalcanal are left completely isolated. All they can do now is prepare for an attack that they know will come. The men dig their defensive positions, working feverishly to complete the airfield with the little equipment at their disposal. They know the airfield is the key. Air cover will be critical if they are to survive until they can be resupplied and reinforced. As the Marines prepare for the fight to come, Allied military commanders hold their breath. Success on Guadalcanal, they know, would only be the first step in the long trek across the Pacific. But failure would be a devastating blow to the Allied cause. If the Japanese can stop the flow of men and materiel to Australia, the war in the Pacific may be lost. August 1942, Stalingrad. As the sun rises, a pall of smoke hangs over the city, and along with it, the threat of German conquest. Having been attacked almost non-stop for the last 24 hours by a seemingly endless stream of Luftwaffe bombers and fighter bombers, Stalingrad is a sea of flames, and the rising sun brings no respite as German bombs continue to fall. These air raids are the prologue of a planned ground assault which Nazi commanders fully expect will drive the Red Army from this military and psychological stronghold on the Volga River. Just north of the city, Army Group B, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, stands poised, having halted briefly to allow the Luftwaffe to soften up the Russian defenses. But with Hitler having decreed that Stalingrad must fall by the 25th, there is little time to waste. With the bombs still falling on the city center, German armor begins its push toward the northern suburb of Rennach. As they advance, the Panzers find themselves engaging divisions which exist primarily on paper and in the wishful thoughts of Stalin and his commanders. They are, by and large, newly recruited, poorly trained, and ill-equipped. Nazi tanks make quick work of the outer defensive lines. By 25 August, the day Hitler had expected to announce the fall of Stalingrad, the Red Army is able to regroup and counterattack, driving the Wehrmacht troops back nearly to the shores of the Volga. The victory is short-lived, however, and by 1st September, the Nazis have not only turned back the counteroffensive, they have pushed deep into Stalingrad. The beginning of the month finds the fate of Stalingrad resting squarely on the shoulders of the newly appointed Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Georgy Zhukov. Having been elevated to his new position on 27 August, he is now second only to Stalin himself in the chain of command, and the Russian leader has made it clear to Zhukov that his immediate task is to keep Stalin's namesake city from falling to the Nazis. On 3 September, Zhukov orders an attack against German supply routes north of the city near the Volga. Intended to stem the flow of Nazi troops and equipment across the river, the offensive grinds to a halt when Red Army troops run out of ammunition. Under direct orders from Stalin, Zhukov again takes up the battle on 5 September. The Russians fight ferociously, but the Germans are too well entrenched. By the 10th, Zhukov reports to Stalin that the effort has been for naught and that Stalingrad may be lost. But even as the message reaches Moscow, the German advance into Stalingrad has begun to slow, and it is the city itself, rather than its defenders, that is impeding the Nazi troops. Aggressive bombing by the Luftwaffe, along with the fierce combat, have filled the streets with rubble, making passage by panzers difficult at best. As a result, most of the fighting must be done by infantry, moving slowly from street to street. The further they progress, the harder they are forced to fight for every foot they take. On 12 September, command of the Russian 62nd Army is taken over by a tough, lean general by the name of Vasily Ivanovich Zhukov. And almost immediately, the Germans' task becomes even more difficult. Declaring to Stalin and to his men, "We shall either hold the city or die there," Zhukov turns his army into a band of urban guerrillas, urging them to conceal themselves in basements and bombed-out buildings. He makes it clear that retreat is not an option, and cowardice will be punished by death. It is not long before his men begin to refer to him as General Stubbornness. Still, despite the slowdown, the German advance continues. By 16 September, the Russians hold only a sliver of the city and are down to their final cohesive line of defense, which is anchored by a huge grain elevator. From their positions in the elevator, the Red Army troops are able to pin down an entire Wehrmacht battalion and stall the German advance for 6 days. Yet, in spite of the heroic efforts of Zhukov's men, by 22 September, the defensive line crumbles. As it does, the men of the 62nd fall back into the smoke and rubble of the city, assembling into small groups, concealing themselves in the ruins of Stalingrad, preparing to hold out at all costs. And so it is that nearly a month after Adolf Hitler had declared that Stalingrad would become his latest conquest, the Wehrmacht seemingly stands poised to deliver the prize to their leader. August 1942, the English Channel. An armada of 253 ships set sail for the coast of France. This marks the beginning of Operation Jubilee, a commando raid on the German-held port of Dieppe. Comprised primarily of Canadian troops, the operation has several goals. First, to help appease Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, who is demanding a second European front. Second, to satisfy the Canadians who have been itching to get into the fight. And third, to destroy vital dock facilities as well as food, ammunition, and fuel stores. The hastily planned operation runs into trouble early. German trawlers spot the force and send up signal flares alerting the defenders of Dieppe. German E-boats attack the landing craft as they make their way to shore, killing many of the men before they ever set foot on land. Upon reaching the beach, things continue to get worse. The landing area is surrounded by a high bluff, concealing German artillery and machine gun positions. It is for the Germans a virtual shooting gallery. The Canadians try desperately to drive inland, advancing into a hail of machine gun and mortar fire. The landscape is covered with dead and wounded men and smashed equipment. After 9 hours of desperate fighting, it is apparent to both sides that Operation Jubilee is an unmitigated disaster. The order is given for the men to retreat to the ships. For many, however, it is too late. Over 1,000 men are dead, and 2,500 are taken prisoner. For the Allies, Operation Jubilee is a hard lesson learned. Any future assault against German coastal defenses must be preceded by massive naval and aerial bombardment, and more important, must be one of overwhelming force. For now, all the Allies can do is retreat to Britain to lick their wounds and wait for another chance at cracking Fortress Europe. They are peas in a pod. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Twin dictators who rode the same tide of European discontent to total control of their respective nations, they now threaten both their own people and the outside world in a way that is almost unparalleled in history. Hitler, of course, is well known, but Italian Premier Mussolini, very much the junior partner in the European Axis, is less familiar. In many ways, however, it was Mussolini who paved the way for Hitler, who showed the Nazi tyrant the path from obscurity to power. Mussolini, like Hitler, was a veteran of World War I who returned to a nation descending into chaos. Unlike the Germans, the Italians were not a defeated nation. But throughout Europe, historic tides were building. The Great Depression, which didn't strike the United States until the 1930s, crippled Europe in the early 1920s. The elite running the continent showed little concern for the plight of the unemployed and starving. From the East, Marxism and its descendant communism promised the increasingly disgruntled masses a kind of paradise where employment was total and want was nothing to fear. Mussolini watched the onset of anarchy as a newspaper writer and editor. Gaining a reputation as a firebrand and enemy of the established order, he was chased out of Austria for his rabble-rousing, and upon landing in his native Italy, quickly thrust himself into the emerging movement of veterans disgruntled with the status quo. In 1919, he created the Fascist Party, ran unsuccessfully for Parliament later that year, and, like Hitler, was implicated in a plot to overthrow his country's government. Unlike Hitler, who served jail time for his treason, Mussolini was spared incarceration. The fascists continued to organize and agitate, and in only 3 years, Mussolini went from disgrace to the Italian premier's office. Christened by his followers Il Duce, the leader, he watched Devil's Garden. Containing more than 500,000 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, the barrier gives Rommel's forces a temporary sense of security. Although they realize that an offensive by Montgomery is inevitable, the minefield presents him with a difficult obstacle. He will need time to marshal his forces in order to breach it. In the meantime, both forces endure the brutal summer of the North African desert. Although the sweltering heat and the millions of biting flies show no favor to either side, life for the Axis troops is decidedly more miserable than for their British counterparts. A severe lack of fresh water makes bathing a luxury the Axis troops cannot afford. Their own unpleasant aroma, coupled with the stench of the battlefield and human excrement, serve to rob the troops of their appetite. Living in filth, undernourished, and fighting the biting flies, the Axis troops begin to lose weight, becoming easy stop in Italy to confer with Mussolini, Rommel continues on to a meeting with Hitler on the 30th. Hitler presents the field marshal with a jewel-encrusted baton and assures him that everything will be done to guarantee an Axis victory in North Africa. Miles from Alexandria and Cairo have the door to Egypt in their hands, and guarantees that after coming so far, troop transport is deemed a legitimate target. In short order, U-156 fires a torpedo at the unsuspecting vessel. Passengers are British women and children. The Laconia is only one of a staggering number of casualties in the battle between the German U-boats and the Allied naval forces. The seas that link the factories of America to the battlefields of Europe and North Africa have become the scene of a deadly cat-and-mouse game, one in which the playing field seems to pitch and roll, much like the ocean itself, favoring one side and then the other. In the early part of the war, supplies carried from America to England often traveled in individual ships without escort. The U-boats, these lone, unarmed travelers, were fish in a barrel. But steadily, the British developed methods and practices that not only reduced the loss of their ships, but also began making a serious dent in Germany's underwater fleet. Freighters began to travel in groups. They were accompanied by vessels specifically designed to combat submarines. Escort aircraft with improved radar and other targeting devices joined with the ships to begin sinking more and more of the marauding U-boats. In the last 4 months of 1941, 66 German submarines were permanently submerged. Just as the North Atlantic was becoming safer for Allied merchantmen, the United States entered the war and opened a window of opportunity for the Nazi subs. Prior to the commencement of hostilities between Germany and the U.S., ships traveling in the coastal waters of America did so without fear of attack. Once war was declared, these ships became fair game for the wolf packs. Despite the presence of only 5 Nazi subs, the final 2 weeks of 1941 saw 46 Allied merchantmen sunk off the east coast of America. Allied losses in the region continued to climb. In June, 121 freighters were sent to the bottom. It was at this point that the U.S. decided, perhaps somewhat belatedly, to institute interlocking convoys between the St. Lawrence and the Caribbean. With the freighters now protected at every point of their journey, American and British commanders might have felt justified in expecting a reduction in shipping losses. Now, however, the Nazis have begun churning out submarines at a phenomenal rate. At the end of 1942, the number of operational U-boats will, in all likelihood, be double what it was in to pay the price. October 1942, Stalingrad. As a beleaguered Red Army, plagued by shortages of weapons, food, and ammunition, struggles to hang on to a small strip of their city, in Washington, officials of the U.S. and USSR are signing an agreement designed to alleviate those deficiencies and bolster the Soviet war effort. Over the next 9 months, American Lend-Lease convoys will deliver nearly 4.5 million tons of supplies. The Soviet military machines starved for equipment and raw materials. The relief can't come too soon as far as Joseph Stalin and his commanders are concerned. In sweeping across Russia, the Nazis have captured factories, foundries, iron and coal mines, and power plants. Soviet output of war material has been reduced by more than 60%. Since the inception of Lend-Lease, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt have diverted shipments intended for Britain to the Russian port of Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean. But these stopgap deliveries have not been enough to sustain the Soviets over the long haul. With the signing of the agreement, the shipping of supplies can begin in earnest. Tons of equipment are loaded at ports in the U.S. and Britain, and the captains and crews prepare for what will probably be the most treacherous voyage they have ever taken. While maritime shipping during wartime has always been hazardous, these supply ships face an added element of danger. The German Navy has stationed destroyers, cruisers, U-boats, and battleships off the northern coast of Norway, putting them almost directly in the path of the Russian-bound fleets. With the Arctic sun shining 24 hours a day, the Nazi ships have had a devastating impact on convoys bound for Murmansk. In one instance, 23 of 34 freighters bound for the Russian port were sent to the bottom by the Germans. This had so shocked Churchill that he ordered a halt to shipments, but Roosevelt, while acknowledging the dangers, insists that they be resumed. The value of the Russian front in diluting Germany's military might is too great to be ignored. All of this has little meaning to the Russian men and women battling in the streets of Stalingrad. They know only that each day brings more fighting, more destruction, more death. Each time they seem to be holding the line, the Wehrmacht mounts yet another offensive. On 14 October, German General Friedrich von Paulus orders an attack in the northern sectors of the city. For von Paulus and his 6th Army, Stalingrad has been no cakewalk. It seems that each crumbling building has been turned into a small Russian fortress, which must be wrenched from the clutches of a resolute Red Army. This offensive is no different. Directly in the path of the attack is a huge tractor factory, which has been occupied and fortified by the Russians. Von Paulus orders 2 Panzer and 2 infantry divisions to clear the factory. The fighting is bloody and intense. It takes 4 days of fighting before the last Soviet soldier is killed and the factory taken. So even as the battle continues and the Germans advance, von Paulus begins to suspect that he and his men may be moving into dire straits. His options are few, however. Pushed forward by a fanatical dictator with little taste for retreat and committed to the point where withdrawal is no longer an alternative, he must instead ask himself, having fought so hard to defeat so few, how he and his men can possibly overcome a whole army of Russians. 21 October 1942, the Atlantic. Steaming from Britain and the United States, an armada larger and more powerful than any in history begins converging off the coast of North Africa. Made up of over 600 ships and carrying over 100,000 men, this fleet is the backbone of an amphibious operation known as Torch, which is intended to begin the rollback of Nazi troops throughout the African continent. Just as important, it is the first large-scale deployment of American troops against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. While the Germans are certainly the primary foe facing the U.S. troops, Allied commanders led by Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower aren't certain whether their first contact will be with the Nazis or with the forces of the Vichy French. Though Rommel's Africa Corps controls much of Libya and western Egypt, the whole of northwest Africa is under the control of the French. The Vichy regime, which chose to cooperate with Hitler after the Nazi conquest of France itself, is technically neutral in Africa. But it is a neutrality without credibility to everyone outside of Berlin, the city of Vichy. Marshal Pétain, a World War I hero who made peace with the German invaders and the head of the Vichy state, is considered by the Allies to be, quite simply, a collaborator. The British, in particular, have reason to be wary of the French. Winston Churchill ascended to the prime ministry on the heels of Neville Chamberlain, who made the mistake of believing Hitler. Despite promises from Pétain and Hitler that French ships would not be co-opted into the service of the Reich, the Royal Navy commandeered and impounded the French fleet. The few French vessels that refused to submit to British boarding were sunk. That action has spurred a great deal of bitterness not only in the Vichy regime, but among the Free French living in exile in London. Charles de Gaulle, who is totally dependent on the British, denounces the move, and French patriots in exile the world over complain that the British are no better than the Nazis. Hoping that the French will be less likely to open fire on American soldiers than British soldiers, the invasion from top to bottom is almost entirely an American operation. exception of a few old-timers who served in the First World War, they are as yet untested in battle. Soon enough, they know, that will change. October 1942, Guadalcanal. Since repulsing the fierce Japanese attacks on Bloody Ridge in mid-September, life for the Marines here has fallen back into a daily routine of misery and boredom broken by moments of stark terror as Japanese bombers pound their positions. Stifling heat, torrential rain, and rampant disease make daily existence on the island nearly unbearable. The Marines are isolated and they know it. Sensing that the number of Japanese on the island is increasing, their morale plummets. After 2 months without relief, even the most gung-ho among them begin to doubt they will ever get off this steamy, malaria-ridden island. Increasingly, Henderson Field, the airfield that is both their reason for being on the island and their hope for salvation, has come under Japanese shelling. Without reliable air cover, the Marines are easy prey for the flights of Japanese bombers passing overhead. U.S. commanders decide that even though they are undermanned, an offensive is necessary to drive the enemy back from the Henderson Field perimeter. On 7 October, the 1st Marine Division attacks west out of the beachhead toward the mouth of the Matanuco River. For the Marines, even the horrendous fighting is a welcome change. After months of boredom and defensive warfare, they are finally taking the battle to the Japanese. In heavy fighting on the 8th and 9th, the Marines wipe out an entire Japanese battalion. With that taste of victory, the Marines are anxious to continue their attack, but incoming intelligence indicates that the Japanese are preparing an offensive of their own. Much to the Marines' dismay, they are withdrawn to their original defensive positions. Again, they wait. Meanwhile, bombers operating from Henderson Field begin to enjoy some success in destroying Japanese transports landing troops on the island. On 13 October, the Imperial Navy, fearing it is losing the upper hand, brings up the battleships Kongo and Haruna to shell the airfield. The shelling continues through the 14th and destroys over 50 aircraft. The Japanese quickly take advantage of the interruption in American air cover and land 4,500 troops and large quantities of supplies west of the Marines' beachhead at Tessaferanga. While the Japanese are busy landing reinforcements for their upcoming offensive, the Marines are also getting some much-needed help. On the 13th, the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment lands on the island, boosting the U.S. contingent to 23,000. On 21 October, the long-awaited attack begins. The main thrust is made by the Japanese 2nd Infantry Division, which drives northward between the Lunga and Tanaru rivers toward the American beachhead. Secondary attacks are launched on the Marines' western flank across the Matanuco. Much like their attacks on Bloody Ridge in September, the Japanese plan is poorly conceived and executed. The commanders have little or no intelligence about the location and disposition of the U.S. forces. They are also attacking from inland, which makes reinforcing their troops extremely difficult. U.S. artillery plays a crucial role in blunting the Japanese attacks. Advancing formations are decimated before they can effectively engage American troops. Even as their casualties mount, rigid Japanese commanders refuse to alter their tactics. They send wave after wave into the killing fields in front of the American positions. Although they are undoubtedly getting the best of the Japanese, the Americans too are receiving heavy casualties. Japanese artillery and tank fire take their toll, as does the increasingly vicious hand-to-hand combat. By 27 October, after a full week of vicious fighting, the offensive peters out and Japanese commanders call off the attack. They have suffered 3,500 casualties, including many of their best officers. Although the Americans, too, are exhausted, the situation on Guadalcanal has now drastically changed. The Japanese, who have until now chosen when and where to fight, have lost the initiative. The Americans, having won a decisive victory, are now preparing to launch their own major offensive, one which, they hope, will give them control of the island. And that may change forever the momentum of the war in the Pacific. 23 October 1942. For the second time in 2 months, outside the Egyptian town of El Alamein, the German and British armies face off against each other. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man used to getting his way, has for weeks been prodding Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to attack the Nazi Africa Corps. Kibitzing by those not actually on the battlefield is a time-honored tradition, of course, and has, through history, created problems for frontline officers. Knowing that, Churchill accepts, in theory, the primacy of his battlefield commanders. Nonetheless, he sees in North Africa the opportunity to score an enormous victory, and he is impatient. Though Monty's hesitancy has frustrated Churchill, as he faces the Germans, the Field Marshal enjoys a tremendous advantage. He has insisted that he will not initiate a battle until his forces are numerically twice as strong as the defending Germans. Despite entreaties from above, Monty knows that time is on his side. Supplies and reinforcements flow freely to the British in North Africa, while the Nazis are having increasing trouble supplying the Africa Corps. The Germans are also suffering from back-of-the-lines kibitzing of their own. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the extraordinarily skilled commander of the Africa Corps, is in Europe for rest and rehabilitation. His defensive plans are being implemented from afar by General Georg Stumme. At 21:30 hours on 23 October, the German defenders hear the drone of British bombers passing high overhead, heading for targets deep behind the lines. 10 minutes later, Montgomery's 900 artillery pieces begin lobbing shells into the German forward positions. The Germans, having been lulled into complacency by Montgomery's hesitation and Rommel's departure, are taken by surprise. Stumme is almost instantly isolated from thousands of troops under his command and, within hours of the opening of the barrage, lies dead on the Saharan sands. The English press forward on a 6-mile front, braving entrenched Germans and unmapped minefields which take an enormous toll. By 24 October, Australians under Montgomery's command take Kidney Ridge, a line of high ground with a clear view of the German 15th Panzer Division. Rommel is ordered by his Führer to return to the battlefield, and upon his arrival in Africa on 25 October, sees that the situation is much more dire than he had been led to believe. If the Germans are to salvage anything from the battle, they need not only to hold the ground they still have, but also to recapture that which they have lost. Kidney Ridge, in particular, must be retaken. However, Rommel's troops have few tools to bring to bear on the British. Not only have German lines of communication largely been severed by the British artillery, but the Nazi tanks have almost no fuel with which to maneuver. They are left fighting an almost pure infantry battle, something for which they are outnumbered and ill-prepared. It is not long before the Australians, using Kidney Ridge as their starting point, punch a huge hole in German lines. On 31 October, Rommel notifies the Luftwaffe that they will soon be needed in an attack he himself will lead. He dispatches Stukas to pound the Australians on Kidney Ridge and drives the remnants of his 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions forward in a desperate counterattack. Incredibly, the attack works, plugging the hole in the German lines and allowing Rommel to momentarily consider an attack on Kidney Ridge itself. Montgomery finds himself looking less at victory than at the possibility of stalemate, exactly the outcome he feared as he rebuffed Churchill's entreaties to attack quickly. Dreading both an extension of the war in Africa and a long series of I-told-you-sos from London, Monty whips up Supercharge, an operation that will throw his armored reserves into action and hopefully break the backs of the Germans. The attack begins 2 November, with an artillery barrage that drops more than 15,000 high-explosive shells on a front barely a mile wide. Infantry pour into the breach, with armor not far behind, and in a matter of hours, 3 British tank divisions are wreaking havoc behind German lines. Rommel sensing the opportunity to kill scores of British tanks while risking few of his own, trains his devastating 88mm guns on the British. In no time, burning armor litters the battlefield. It appears that the Germans might well be on the verge of victory when flights of British bombers begin to swoop down on the 88s, picking them off one by one. By sunset, enough artillery has been silenced that the British positions behind German lines are secure. 30,000 German troops are dead or captured, and 2/3 of Rommel's guns destroyed. The Desert Fox, resigned to the inevitable, orders his remaining troops to withdraw. Der Führer, dispensing orders from the comfort of the German capital, berates Rommel for his prudence in cutting his losses, demanding instead victory or death. Rommel, with the blessing of his commander, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, ignores the kibitzing from the rear and pulls his forces back 120 miles to Mersa-Matruh. Montgomery takes a moment to indulge in a little back-of-the-line supposition of his own, thinking out loud that perhaps he should dispatch someone to capture Rommel. That, like Hitler's order to win or die, is easier said from the rear than done on the lines. November 1942, North Africa. In the early morning hours, a group of U.S. Army Rangers comes ashore near the port of Arzew, some 30 miles to the west of Oran. These Rangers are the spearhead of a massive invasion by Allied forces. Some 100,000 men, most of them Americans, divided into 3 separate task forces, begin to move ashore in an area of operations that spans some 500 miles. This is Operation Torch, the first major assault by U.S. ground troops against the Axis. In charge of the endeavor is an American Lieutenant General, Dwight David Eisenhower. In taking on the task, Eisenhower was aware that it would require much more than the organization and execution of a military action. If the plan were to succeed fully, British and American soldiers, from the command staff down to the men on the front lines, must abandon their military and political differences and act as a team. Now, as his troops begin to move ashore, Dwight Eisenhower will be given a chance to see, as few men ever are, just how successful his labors have been. At Arzew, the rest of the 18,000 men of the Central Task Force begin to move ashore here and at Oran to the west. 3 regimental combat teams of the Army's 1st Division hit the beach and begin moving inland. Directly behind them, transports begin to unload some 180 tanks, which promptly join the battle. Thankfully for these men, Allied intelligence has been excellent, and the surprise is complete. Although there is some resistance, Axis troops in both cities soon run up the white flag. Contributing to the rapid surrender is the fact that these are not German soldiers. They are rather Vichy French, and while the government for which they bear arms is in cahoots with Hitler's Germany, many view the Germans as invaders of their homeland. While the troops here continue their push toward Oran, the men of the Eastern Task Force landing near Algiers find the going somewhat more difficult. While the task force is comprised primarily of British troops, the initial landing is made by the U.S. 34th Infantry Division. Eisenhower and his staff reason that the French may be more willing to surrender to American forces. It appears, however, that these French soldiers are none too willing to surrender to anyone. As the 6,000 Americans begin landing, French shore batteries fire on the invading troops. Soon enough, though, they are silenced when Allied warships offshore respond in kind. While the British forces begin to come ashore and join in the fray, the Americans continue to advance inland. By 8:30 a.m., French commanders along the coast are ready to negotiate a surrender. In Morocco, the Western Task Force is having the most difficult time of the 3. Unlike the other 2 groups, which traveled from English ports, the Western Task Group, operating under the command of Major General George S. Patton, sailed from the United States. Now, having survived the journey, the ocean they have just crossed seems unwilling to let them go ashore. As the landing craft move toward the beach, the turbulent sea batters them about. Many never make it. Once on land, things begin to look up. The French are totally unprepared. The city of Safi falls quickly, and soon after, Patton comes ashore. Reports filtering back to General Eisenhower at Allied Forces headquarters are by and large positive. Despite continued fighting, all three task forces have landed and are pushing toward their objectives. Perhaps more important, the combined land, sea, and air forces of the U.S. and Britain are functioning as a single, cohesive military force. Yet for all the good news, Eisenhower's gratification is diminished by the cruel realities that ultimately confront all military leaders. For along with reports of the initial successes, come reports of the first American men to sacrifice their lives in the battle against the Axis. Medics spend hundreds of hours hunting for the stagnant pools in which mosquitoes breed. When larvae are found, they spray the surface of the water with oil, both suffocating and poisoning the pests, before calling in bulldozers to destroy the breeding ground. As troublesome as the plants and insects are, the terrain of the islands poses even more of an obstacle to providing medical treatment. Delivery of supplies presents a massive logistical problem. The crates of pills, bandages, and precious plasma come in by airdrop, truck, mule, even on the backs of GIs. Even more daunting than getting supplies to medics in the jungles is the problem of getting wounded men out. The forces on any given island are spread across miles of land impassable on anything but foot. Medics must carry their fallen comrades out of harm's way on stretchers, a hard means of travel that only compounds injuries. Upon arrival at the battalion aid station, doctors examine the wounded and pin a man's medical information to his shirt with an emergency medical tag. Those who can be helped immediately receive attention and are sent back to the line. Others are sent on for further treatment. The most desperate are handled on the spot. Surgery is performed in makeshift operating rooms. Tents and dugouts are all these hospitals can offer to protect the men from further injury and infection. Those requiring more extensive treatment go to the collecting station and, if need be, to a hospital ship. There, expert medical care is available, as well as relatively peaceful time to recuperate. Only the most seriously wounded return home. The rest, once fully recovered, will rejoin their units at the front. Watching the men return to battle, one cannot help but be struck by the irony faced by the medics and doctors. If they do their jobs well and are successful in healing their patients, they can only watch in silence as the same men they have mended are thrust back in harm's way. Despite that, they approach their jobs with all the fierce intensity of a soldier in battle. They know that without the care that only they can provide, the Allied battle for the islands of the South Pacific is as good as lost.